Recording and the webinar. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the fifth installment of our high elevation 5-needle white pine 2024-2025 Science and Management webinar series. I'm Enzo Martelli, a PhD student in Karen Nelson's lab at the University of Montana, and I'm co-organizing this webinar with Lou DeLuzzi, a PhD student in Daniel's Ulrich lab at Montana State University, and Karina Lee, a master's student in the Anna Tombach's Forest Ecology Lab at CU Denver. Thanks for joining us today. If you miss any of our previous installments, you can find the recordings of the talk on our YouTube channel, Whitebark Flicks. The link to our website will be posted in the chat in a couple seconds. And just a reminder, after the presentation today, we will have a Q&A session where you can share all your comments, doubts, and questions, and please post them on the chat box and our team will be collecting them. For comments, we recommend you to give context on the slide or part of the presentation you're referring to, just to make it easier for us to refer to our presenter. And before starting today's presentation, I'd like to introduce Haley Moran, who became the first full-time executive director of the Whitebark Pine Ecosystem Foundation Canada in August of last year. Haley holds a Bachelor's of Science in Biology from the University of Victoria and has a strong background in strategic communications, project management, and nonprofit leadership. Haley has worked with Van Dunstan Botanical Garden and Blotto Conservatory, Surrey's Natural Areas Partnership, Parks Canada, the City of Surrey's Urban Forestry Team, and the Greater Vancouver Zoo. And we'll share a few announcements with us before we end this presentation. Welcome, Haley.
Thank you so much for welcoming me here today. Good morning to some, good afternoon to others, and thanks everyone for joining this amazing webinar series put forth by the Whitebark Pine Ecosystem Foundation. So again, my name is Haley. I am the Executive Director of the Whitebark Pine Ecosystem Foundation of Canada. So we work really closely with the foundation in the States, but we are two separate entities, which is a great clarification to make and an awesome opportunity to talk to this audience here today. We are really lucky to share a passionate community. We share knowledge and resources to work together across borders and across jurisdictions, as we have a lot of common goals in our work. So the Whitebark Pine Ecosystem Foundation of Canada is dedicated to the conservation, restoration, and recovery of whitebark and limber pine, specifically across their Canadian ranges. Our work really is focused in BC and Alberta. We focus our work through partnerships, science-based active management, hands-on restoration, research, and education to protect these critical high elevation ecosystems. And again, we work really closely with the US Foundation because we're both focused on unique challenges and conservation needs within our respective countries while still having a lot of alignment as well. So today I'm here to introduce Randy Moody, who is the president of the Whitebark Pine Ecosystem Foundation of Canada. He has been instrumental in leading the efforts and brings a wealth of knowledge and expertise and a lot of passion to his work. So please join me in welcoming Randy Moody to the presentation to give us a great information and share with you all. And then I'll also be sharing some links in the chat if you want to learn more about the Canadian Foundation. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Haley. I hope you all can hear me okay. Yeah, while I'm loading up the talk here, I'll just keep talking about myself a little bit. When they asked me to make this presentation, I have to admit I was a little reluctant in that, I'm not a pure researcher by any stretch of the imagination. I'm not affiliated with a university or a research group. I'm more of a, for those of you who attended the Revelstoke meeting last year, there was a talk put on by a tree planter who talked about being an not an ist, I think it was. Like he's a planter, not a biologist. And even though I am a biologist, I do kind of straddle that line between somebody who does a lot, gets my hands dirty and does a lot, and does like some management reports, etc. But I don't have like a pure dedicated research bent other than restoring whitebark pine. And I do a lot of little things. So when they asked me to make this talk, I thought, well, I don't have one real hot area like rust screening that I can talk to or anything like that I'm like really an expert in. I was telling them, like, if anybody here knows track and field well, which I do because it's the greatest sport in the world. There's these folks called decathletes. They do a bunch of events okay, but because they can do so many events somewhat well, they've made a full event out of it. They're not the best at anything, but they're okay at a few things. That's how I consider myself. I'm pretty good at a lot of things. Not really an expert in anything, but so anyway, this talk kind of cobbles together a bunch of smaller projects that I've worked on over time that kind of are quite variable from one to the next. There's some of them have no connection to each other whatsoever, but I don't know. I just thought they might be a little interesting. So anyway, before I get started on the talk, just a little bit of background about, well, just a couple photos of whitebark pine in Canada as well, before I get started here. Okay, let's see here. Oh, there we go. So here's some background on me. I've been restoring whitebark pine for 22 years now. I've done work for government, industry, nonprofits, and First Nations. So this is all various little contract work, bits and pieces here and there. This is work that I did with Parks Canada, just at the BC Alberta border. This is actually in a provincial park, not in a national park. That's Mount Robson in the background. And as mentioned earlier, I've done a range of research and monitoring projects that I'll discuss here. So some of the featured projects that I'm going to discuss are translocations, which is moving trees, flower stimulation, so can we encourage reproduction in whitebark pine? Field grafting of whitebark pine, which when I get there, it's a novel idea and it has some roles here and there. Good old planting, very common approach to recovery, and First Nations collaborations that I've undertaken in my work with whitebark pine. For our American counterparts that might be, you might know these as tribal collaborations. Just a couple photos of whitebark pine in Canada here. Here's a couple nice trees. The one on the left is in the South Chilcotin Provincial Park, which is, let's say, an hour north of Whistler. It's in the rain shadow of the Coast Mountains, and then the tree on the right there, that's up above Wassa Lake, which is just near Kimberley here. In fact, if I turn around and look out my window, I can see exactly where that tree is. And here's a couple limber pine as well. That we also get some big limber pine out here. The limber pine on the left is near Canal Flats, and the one on the right, you can see the person on the left of the photo for some scale there. That limber pine, that's in a place called Andygood Creek, which is just on the BC Alberta border, but on the BC side. Now this next piece, this is a bear eating whitebark pine. And I just included this because we've got a lot of grizzly bears in BC, and everywhere we work, we deal with grizzly bears, pretty much, without maybe two exceptions along the Canada-US border. In Cathedral Park and Manning Park don't have much in the way of a grizzly population, but everywhere we do work, we have the chance of encountering these guys. And I include this because many of you know that this is the hook to get people into whitebark quite often. It can be a challenge to get folks to just work on the tree, but when you use the grizzly bear, which this video has done us wonders for, it gets people really interested in whitebark pine further. This is a captive bear, Boo, up in Kicking Horse Resort in Golden, and he's been in captivity since he was a 1-year-old cub, orphaned. His mom was poached, and he knew exactly what to do with whitebark pine cones. And as far as we know, he never had the chance to feed on whitebark in the wild. So it was really interesting when we gave him those cones and the videos they made, how he knew exactly what to do with them. He knew they were a food source and went straight to it. So anyway, as I mentioned, that's just sort of a little summary of whitebark in Canada. Grizzly bears, lots of them, and we utilize them to encourage people to be more interested in whitebark. So now on to the talk. Translocations. This is a subject that comes up more often than you would think, and that's moving whitebark pine. And we've primarily done this in industrial settings where a project is going to impact whitebark pine, and the folks want them to ask, instead of just planting more, can you actually move what you've got? You see this with cacti in the desert all the time, not all the time, but you do see this with other plant species, and we've done it a little bit with whitebark pine. It's just on a trial basis, but we've done it 3 different locations. One thing we did this year was we measured the root area to help improve outcomes because we had no idea how we should prescribe this activity. And the outcomes of this can also be used to support other initiatives, such as rootstock. For example, that little tree there in the pot, that maybe doesn't need to be planted on site, but we can put it aside and use it as rootstock for our seed orchards, because that seems to be a constant problem up here, is having enough rootstock to graft onto. So here's just some photos of transplanting whitebark pine. You can see on the left, you can see how long those roots are that come out of that tree. And you can see, if you look closely, that's the blade of the excavator digging it. Now, in these 2 examples here, we've obviously got big machinery helping us out. Quite often we've done this by hand with smaller trees, but now and then you get these opportunities to excavate and work on your larger trees. And that photo on the right there, you can see just how wide of a berth we give these trees. And the way we do it is, start, say, about 2 times the tree height out from the tree, and basically trench around it, and then just slowly work in until we hit a root area. And then from there, basically the machinery goes aside and we excavate by hand to move the tree. And here's some of the results of the translocations. The table on the left there, that's the measurements of the tree height to the root length. And these are all smaller trees. We don't do the largest trees. Those trees in that photo, the one would probably be the largest tree we move. And you can see the root length to tree height ratio. You can get up to 2 times the root length to the tree height. So if you have a 1 meter tall tree, your roots might extend in a radius out of 2 meters. So that's why when we're doing this translocation work, we start very wide and work our way in. And we didn't really have these numbers until this year. We'd kind of just messed around out there. And this year we decided to, let's actually measure what we're doing and see if we can come up with some guidance. And, the average is about 1.45 times the tree height. But, to be safe, we tell people to start about twice the height out and work your way in until you see roots. So what have we learned from doing all this translocation work? Survival, it's variable. It ranges from about 5% to 78% across the 3 studies that we've done. The root mass can be very extensive, not only 2 times the height, but it can go deep as well. And it's very substrate related, obviously. In nice soils, it can go deep. Rocks, believe it or not, are our friend. They limit root growth, and you can just pick the rocks away and really have very little impact to the root. In fact, I would argue, we don't have numbers on this, but I would say trees excavated from rocky sites do better than trees excavated from nice soil. And survival has a negative relationship with height. Smaller trees survive better, and that just makes sense in that it's easier to excavate them. And tending the translocations can improve survival. So, a lot of these sites, they're industrial sites, they'll go back and water the translocations after they've been moved. They haven't fertilized anything, but watering is the key thing. And in fact, in the spring, when these translocations are happening, they'll move snow so that snow is there to melt and prolong spring. So they're fairly well looked after, and that can improve survival quite a bit. But I would still caution you to only translocate where needed. Survival, as you see above, it's only moderate. It's very labor intensive. You saw the machinery out there, and it's expensive. Maybe it's not the best thing to spend your money on, but sometimes it's a requirement of a permit, or there's other needs that you can meet by excavating the trees, especially if the machinery is already on site and sitting idle. but it's not my first choice, but sometimes it appears, and it can work. So the next study that I'll highlight a little bit is flower stimulation, and that I mean stimulating cones, pollen or female cones. So the primary objective of this study was to determine if we can improve the production of pollen or female cones through cultural practices. And we applied gibberellic acid to juvenile whitebark pine, and by juvenile I mean trees about that size in front of you there. GA3 was applied by spraying it to the crown, and GA47, which is another gibberellic acid, it was injected directly into the stem, and the applications were 2 weeks apart. And we also conducted partial girdling to induce stress. We applied fertilizer, and we did combinations of all these treatments. We treated 157 trees in 2019. And we monitored those trees in 2021. So here's just some pictures of us in action here. I'll just go back here. The foliar spray on the right, that's GA3. It's you just mix it up and spray it to the upper crown where the cones might form. This is the GA47. We drilled holes into the trees and then injected with a syringe the GA47 into the stem. And here on the left, this is partial girdling. So what we did there is, if you think of two horseshoes that are facing opposite directions going around the tree, so you can see the top girdle does not complete all the way. You can see that where the top girdle ends there, and on the bottom where you can't see the other side, it also would be incomplete there. So it's kind of impartial girdling on both sides. And this allows nutrients and water to still find their way as needed, but it induces a great amount of stress in the tree, and it can stimulate cone production. And then this picture on the right, which I probably should have zoomed in a little further, but I wanted to also show, these trees aren't the biggest. They're about 3.5 meters tall or so. And if you look closely, just to the left of the pole, you can see a cone, and there's also several small developing cones in the crown of this tree. So we definitely did see some reproduction happening out there. And here's the results from what we did. If you look on the far left column, treated trees, you can see that our numbers per treatment were not evenly distributed whatsoever. And a lot of that reason was we didn't want to necessarily girdle too many trees because we weren't sure if we were going to be killing them. And the GA3 application, where you can see there's 45 that received that. A lot of that was also because we needed smaller trees for that, because we had to reach the top, and there was a lot of small trees in the stand. So, the treatments were kind of quite variably spaced, but this was just a fact-finding study to see what would come of this. And if you look at the far right, you can see just how many, this is percentage, not raw numbers, but if you look at the far left, you can figure out the raw numbers there. And we were actually getting some pretty decent cone production in quite small trees. These are, like you can see the next column over, these are just 4-meter tall trees roughly. And for the GA47 and girdle combination, 3 out of 11 trees produce cones, and 2 out of 12 in the GA47 fertilized combo produce cones, which, it's not a huge number, but in that stand of trees that height, probably not long. There's not a lot of cone production in smaller trees at all, for sure. So what did we learn through this flower stimulation study? One is this was just a preliminary study. The uneven samples that we did, it makes determining strong trends a challenge, but we're hoping to revisit this and have a better design study in the future. GA3, that was the foliar spray. That had the least effect, but it had to be sprayed on. So the sample cohort, as I mentioned, was much smaller trees. Girdling had mixed results, but GA47 and fertilizing combined had the best results. And in the literature, other studies showed that this also had good results, not of whitebark pine, but of other tree species. And that effect can last for several cone production years. But the GA47 on its own had little effect, but a good effect when combined with other treatments, as mentioned about fertilizing and with the girdling as well. And other studies have shown that as well. The combined treatments are typically more effective than single treatments. So what we need to do is we certainly need to establish a more controlled study. There was control trees in there. They weren't in the table that, there was no cone production really in the stand. There were some bigger trees in there mixed in that had cones, but they were much larger than our cohorts. The application of the timing of the application may matter as well. The GA3, for example, you got to spray that on the top. It didn't rain following ours, but say it did, that could be a problem. As well, when you're going into these stands to apply these treatments, if they're already starting to produce pollen, that won't work. We were early enough that that wasn't a problem, but it'd be good to stratify out a few different trials where you're applying these treatments at different times just to see what works better, how early you need to be in the season, etc. So anyway, interesting study that really should be revisited with a more controlled approach. Next up is field grafting. Yes, this is interesting. The primary objective of this study was to determine if field grafting is this a viable management option for whitebark pine scion. If you look on the right on the photo there, you can see our grafted scion at the very top, grafted onto these rootstock in the field. And this is wild rootstock. This is in a cut block. It had been harvested and a lot of whitebark pine left behind. So what we did is we grafted scion from 15 parents. 9 scion per parent were grafted in the field and 5 were grafted into pots. And the 5 in the pots was a more typical approach. It's usually done with grafting scion. And so a lot of people ask me, why are we doing this? What's the why behind this? And a lot of times the reasoning behind this was we don't know when we may need to graft suddenly. If, for example, wildfire may be about to burn down some of your plus trees or your elite trees. Timber harvest may be impacting your trees, other industrial impacts. It also allows for scion to be collected at the time of cone collection, especially in really remote sites where going back to collect additional material is going to be costly. If you're able to collect scion in the fall at the same time, graft it onto a very easily accessible site like this one is. This one you can drive your truck right to it and have lunch in your truck. And then you've got this scion stored temporarily while the material the cones you collected from that site are being tested for rust resistance, etc. And if you have any winners, any rust resistant trees, you can just revisit this site and collect your already stored scion, and you didn't have to give up any rootstock for this or anything else. You just grafted it into a nice, easy, accessible site to use in the interim. So, between logistics and when your trees are at risk and you don't have rootstock available, both good times to possibly consider field grafting. Here's just some photos of the grafting process. Every one of those orange stakes you see on the left photo there has an individual scion grafted onto it. And every scion on the right, as you look at the photo on the right, you can't see the tag, but every scion was tagged with the number. There was multiple numbers kicking around out here. So every scion was tagged along with every orange stake so that we could pair them all up and make sure that we can keep track of things. And here's our results from this study. Let's see here. What's the best one to look at? So you can see that this graph is divvied up into pot grafts and field grafts. Remember, pot grafts are our typical way of doing things. Field grafts is the novelty in this study. So in 2024, the pot grafts had 60% of the pot grafts had died, and roughly just around 40% were alive, 2.7% stressed, and 37% were alive and healthy. And in the field graphs, almost identical numbers, 58.5% were dead, and 37.8 were alive and healthy, and 3.7% live and stressed. So really no difference between the two grafting types, which is kind of nice because, as I mentioned, this would be done as a stopgap if in emergency situations, or to warehouse stock or scion until we know resistance results. But what were those numbers here? One thing about this is they're strongly parent oriented. So those mortalities, if you look here, all of these parents had every single scion die on either pot grafts or field grafts. So, it just speaks to the importance of good scion collection and care after you've collected your scion. Here's a photo. Unfortunately, I don't know who I took these photos, but I don't know who set up the little display here on the right-hand side. You can see a photo of different scion here. The ones on the far right are quite brown inside in the top photo, and the one on the left is a little bit white with a little bit of browning on the inside. And then the bottom photo, you can see quite a bit of brown on the inside of that scion, with a little bit of brown on the right one, but not as much. And I should point out that at the time of grafting those scion, the woman doing the grafting commented quite frequently about, there's something on this scion, you better take notes of it. Hey, you better take notes of it. Like, there's lots of brown on this scion, etc. And she said she hadn't really experienced that before, but she was during this round of scion grafting. So, it definitely speaks to, we must look after our scion if we want good grafting results. So, what are our results here, and what have we learned? One is that field grafting compares well with pot grafting. There's a strong family effect. So, as you saw on the previous table, like 100% of certain families all died, likely not genetic related, but related to the quality of the scion. Scion quality is an important variable. And field grafting may be incorporated into management where conditions require. As I mentioned, industrial impacts that are possibly going to destroy really good trees, or fires, things like that, where you know something about the genetics, or on your way to learning something about the genetics of those trees, and you want to make sure you make copies of them, but perhaps you don't have the resources to dip into rootstock. So that's it for field grafting. Now, on to planting, which is probably something everybody on this call has done. And this I feel like this picture here highlights nicely some of the challenges of planting. If you look in the middle of the photo, you can see a planter there, and you can see a big dead whitebark pine behind them in this wildfire landscape. And this is dry country. So, planting whitebark pine, you're often faced with these unforgiving sites. So in planting, I want to review a little bit about the planting site selection. In these small studies we did, we surveyed four different site types: hot versus cool sites, and disturbed versus undisturbed sites. So straight to the results here. Unfortunately, not many photos of planting, just because. So that if you look closely here, you'll see red text versus white text. Red text is hot sites. So looking back at this picture here, that would be a hot site, probably rocky, dry, south facing. But it's also where nutcrackers like to put whitebark pine, right? So it's often where we think we need to go. So if you look at the survival on these sites, the Bill Nye, looking at the top 4 rows, the Bill Nye site on the hot sites had 97% and 77% of the stock either dead or missing. That's after 1 year only. And 3 to 23% were alive. Whereas the Bill Nye cool site had 83% and 87% still alive. So, and I want to point out that these sites were probably about separated by about 50 meters. If you walk down the center of a ridge and went to the left side, you're on your hot slope. On your right side, you're on your cool slope. Um, and survival was quite striking between the two. And then another example of hot versus cool was on the Skyline Ridge Trail in Manning Park. 100% of our hot sites were dead, and 87% of our cool sites were alive. And I want to point out that when we plant on these hot, dry sites, we always microsite. We're always planting in the shade of a log. We're always looking for rocks to plant against. We're always trying to protect our seedlings. So it's not like these were just put out into the sun to die. These were planted well and against various features. Okay, next up is a little study we did that compared disturbed results with undisturbed soil. So we had an area where a company had established a series of drill pads up in what we call the parkland zone, which has trees kind of scattered throughout the landscape. It's not a forest, but it's not a alpine tundra either. It's kind of a hybrid between the two. Tree islands are common. And if you look at those three sites highlighted in yellow, those are our control sites. Those are undisturbed. Those are just planting in the undisturbed soils. Oh. And if you look at the anyway, okay. If you look at the survival of everything, you'll notice that 2024 survival, pretty much everything has fairly comparable survival of 92%, 80%, 80. You know, there's the odd site that had 56 and 60%, but the three controlled sites at 84%, 92%, and 60% were roughly the same survival as was found through our treated areas, our excavated drill pads. But where things get a little bit different is in the final column there, mean height. So this is the height of the seedlings. And this is 25 seedlings were planted at each trial. So this is from the surviving cohort. And in the control trials, we had seedling heights averaging 16.3 centimeters, 26.2, which isn't bad, and 18.7 centimeters. So that's 16.3 and 18.7. Those are barely taller than the seedlings that were planted. And I should point out that these were planted 8 years ago. These are 8-year-old seedlings. And just to highlight a few spots in the trial areas, the excavated drill pads that were planted with the same seedlings, exact same seed lots. You know, we've got seedlings as tall as 47 centimeters, average of 47 centimeters, almost 48, 45, etc. So the seedlings grew much taller in the disturbed soil than they did in the control areas. And here's just a couple of photos illustrating that. The photo on the right is your control. It's kind of hard to see the seedlings in there. These are actually not too bad, those ones on the right. And the ones on the left are in the disturbed soil, which had much more biomass being put on. They were not only taller, but also wider trees growing. And here's another good photo here. The left is our disturbed soil. You can see the big tall tree in the center there and quite a few tall trees scattered throughout. And on the right, just to the right of that big stake and behind that large rock in the foreground, this is our control planting. And these are, you know, they virtually haven't grown since the time of planting, many of them. There's a few decent ones in the far right, but for the most part, very little growth here. And I should point out, I should have included a map here. These sites were separated by about 10 meters. This is exactly the same slope. These are all within several, 10 meters of each other, each trial. So one here, one there, another drill pad there, another control there. So very similar. They were ecologically identical and very different results in terms of tree height growth, not so much in survival. And there's a nice 8-year-old seedling there. So what have we learned from planting? Thinking back to the earlier part, the hot and dry, one is select climate safe sites for planting. Yeah, look at your sites and just think, what if we get a heat dome again? Are my seedlings going to get nuked? We need to be perhaps think a little more in terms of seedling safety as opposed to what sites we like to see whitebark pine on. Micro siting does help, but suitable macro sites may be a better option. And by that I mean if you have two slopes, one's a cool slope and one's a hot, rather than going onto the hot slope and micro siting well and doing everything you can to make sure those seedlings survive, perhaps be better off selecting a site itself, a broad scale site where moisture levels are a little bit better and the seedlings won't be quite as stressed. And tying all three of these together, hot rocky sites, I now call them nutcracker sites. We just sort of say, we see you dead whitebark on the slope, on this ridge or whatever. We're just going to leave you for the nutcrackers because planting seedlings here is not likely to do us. We're not going to probably reach too many recovery objectives if we plant on these hot rocky sites. So we just refer to those as nutcracker sites. We'll maybe scatter a few in, but not to the densities that we do on the moister, cooler sites. And production on disturbed sites is not surprising for a pine. Of course, we all know pine likes mineral soil. All pines do. But this may have implications for restoration on disturbed landscapes where industrial players have to restore, etc. There's, perhaps it's not a terrible idea to tell them, replanting your roads with whitebark pine, replanting your drill pads, as opposed to establishing populations on undisturbed sites within their permitted area. And it also posed the question, when does a disturbed site transition to become more like a controlled group? Many of you, myself included, are probably looking at old burns to plant. And it's one thing to plant a 10-year-old burn, 20-year-old burn where there's still lots of mineral soil exposed. But you often find older burns that have really poor recruitment on them. And do they cross a threshold where you're not going to get the greatest returns in terms of production on this site, in terms of tree growth? And I just wanted to add to all of this, as I'm doing it, one thing I didn't mention here was this selecting climate safe sites. Competition can be a problem, of course, and we know that. So we either wait a few years to plant those sites, we can get a good idea of what competition is going to be like. Or we look into the crown to see what is the species that was here before. If it was a lodgepole pine site that swept over and there's not lodgepole pine regen coming in thick or something, then we'll plant as well. Regardless, we want to make sure that we balance seedling survival with competition. And, if the seedling survives but competition's going to kill it, that's just as bad as planting on the hot sites. So trying to find that balance. So on these cool sites, we'll sometimes let it sit for a few years and go into older burn where we can see that competition is not going to be a problem, or it hasn't been a problem yet. And then, of course, there's First Nations work. I do quite a bit of this across the province of BC with the Ahaniwatine, Tunaha, Statlium, Upper Similkameen, Elgacho, SXFN, and Simp First Nations, to name a few. And the fellow on your right there, that's Norman William. He's a Ahaniwatine First Nation member. And my time working with him, I worked with him for 4 or 5 years, a couple weeks a year. I can't say enough about working with Norman. His knowledge of the landscape up there was phenomenal. And, one of the most interesting things is Chilcotin is his first language. He speaks very little English compared to Chilcotin. So there was a bit of a communication barrier at first. But once you embrace it and, just the amount that I could learn from this guy, especially in his traditional territory, was just amazing. We would be driving through lodgepole pine forests and he would say, "Stop the truck." And we would get out and he'd go barging through this lodgepole pine forest that was very homogeneous. There was no landscape marker as far as I could tell. And we'd come upon the little rocky bluff that was covered in whitebark pine in the middle of the forest. And I'd ask him, like, how did you know this was here? And he said, well, when you told me about the tree, I knew where they grew, etc. And I said, when was the last time you were here? And he thought it was probably about 15 years ago that he had been there. But he just, he just remembered where all these trees were. He was a phenomenal asset to work with in that area. And as well, one of the other more rewarding things we did is, as I mentioned, Norman speaks Chilcotin language, and a lot of people in his community do. For example, if I gave a presentation, we would have to have a translator present to translate the presentation into Chilcotin as we gave the talk, especially with the elders. So here's an example of two posters. It still irks me that the one on the right has a couple English headings on it. But if you look at the left, this is the English poster we made. And on the right is a poster in the Chilcotin language. These were put up at their visitor center in Namaya Valley, where the Honeywateen people live. And this is so the elders can read about and learn about whitebark pine. And it's all in their traditional language. It was a really interesting project for sure, and very rewarding. So what have we learned in working with, what have I learned, I should say, in working with whitebark, with First Nations of whitebark pine? One is the integration of Western science with traditional knowledge can be very effective. As I mentioned, Norman showing me where trees were. And, at first there was a bit of disconnect into what tree I'm looking for. But once he saw it and knew that he had eaten it in the past, locals talked and they knew exactly where to find it. For example, here's one on the side of Choco Lake here that they knew about to collect cones from. And there's extensive undocumented cultural use of whitebark pine. If you look in the literature, there's a little bit mentioned here and there. But when you go into the communities and talk to them, they've all got stories. I was just out in Lillooet last week, and one of the elders was talking about in the 1940s, his grandma told him that they used to go here and collect it. Tons of traditional undocumented cultural use of whitebark pine for sure. And when you're integrating our recovery objectives with theirs, we need to remember that our objectives may differ. We had a spot we wanted to plant, and Darwin kind of told our colleague, like, no, you can't plant whitebark pine here. This is where we come to collect our berries every year. We don't want, this disturbed. Just leave it for our berry patches. Don't do that. So, we have to respect that it's not all about whitebark pine. And there's also a lot of local knowledge gaps that can be filled in by this traditional knowledge. As I mentioned, Norman showing where different trees were that weren't mapped. There was no VRI. There was no map telling us where it was. And likewise, at this meeting I just had last week with the Statlium Nation, we were looking at spots they could plant, and we were looking at historic fire maps that go back at least as far as 1917, if not longer, and saying we want to plant here, here, and here. And the locals came up and said, what about planting at that other burn, which does not appear on the maps? And they knew about it because a lot of them have these programs where they call them cultural guardians and range rider programs, where they go out and they basically go within their territory just to make sure everything's going okay out there. And these guys knew of burns that were unmapped, and they showed us on the air photo, there's a burn right here that's not on any maps. And you zoom in, and sure enough, you can see debris, trees laying all over the ground there. It burned at some point in history, and they knew it, but we didn't. So there's this great, interaction that can happen and improve our recovery, what we can recover, where we can recover. And if we're doing it in partnership with the First Nations, it's a total win-win, because they are the stewards of the land, especially within their traditional territories. So overall, all these programs, what have we learned? One is that translocations, this is a summary of everything I've talked about. One is translocations can work, but you need to find objectives that warrant it, because it's really expensive. Cone production stimulation. it's likely. It likely does work, but we need more research, more controlled research for sure to just to document that better. Field grafting of scion, again, is relatively successful and it can play an intermediate role and be important for certain circumstances. I don't think we all need to go field grafting tomorrow, but if there's a fire burning up your trees and you have no rootstock, etc., there might be times where you need it. When it comes to planting, reserve certain sites for Clark's nutcrackers to regenerate, and select disturbed mesic sites to improve seedling survival. So sites with decent moisture that have been recently disturbed, as opposed to these hot, dry sites where we like to say, look, whitebark pine's here, it's been here. But I often tell people, we don't know how many seeds a nutcracker had to forget about before a tree was able to establish there. We don't know if 100 seeds germinated to get one tree. We have no idea. So, take those existing sites with whitebark pine when they're hot and dry with a bit of grain of salt when planting. And First Nations, of course, have a high level of local knowledge and traditional knowledge that integrates well into Western science. We need to build these relationships in the near term. And I underscore in the near term, because a lot of these pieces that I gather from folks out there are from elders. I would say folks that are my age, I'm 50 years old, have the same local knowledge in many cases as I have regarding whitebark pine in the region. It's still held a lot by elders out there. And if you're having a meeting with technicians, try to find time to include some elders at that meeting so they can share their wisdom, because those folks are getting on. They're not going to be here forever. So we need to build these relationships in the near term. And that's about it. There's a photo of Norman, who I mentioned many times. This is in his traditional territory. This is overlooking Taseko Lake. He helped us collect cones and plant trees out there. And here's a summary of all the different groups that have helped with these projects over time.
That's awesome. Thank you, Randy. I'm going to take it from here.
Sounds good.
So personally, I thought this talk was fantastic. The lessons you described from these studies have really obvious practical value for improving five-needle pine restoration, and I really enjoyed that information on working with First Nations. So thank you so much. So I'm going to go ahead and open up the conversation. This is an opportunity to ask some questions from our attendants and comments. So this is your chance. Go ahead and pop your questions in the chat box. We'll get to as many as we can. And then whatever we don't have time for, we'll probably just send you a separate message with their contact information, and you can get to them on your own time. All right. Yeah, we've got about 12 minutes left. So let's see what we can get to here.
I see a couple in the chat.
Yeah, we've got them kind of lined up.
Yeah, I don't know which is the order of operation here. And I'll say there was a few comments there. Yes, it's 2-year-old stock that we plant. And Sybil mentioned stuff in the north. And a lot of what I mentioned about planting on hot sites kind of falls away in the north. We get better survival. We do a bunch of planting near Valemount, which is near Jasper, that we get better survival on than the planting we do in the south. And I think a lot of that has to do with the northern climate that's a little more moderate. Sure, it gets hot up there, but we get hot into October, November, sometimes even in early November. So the north, I think, is a good safe spot for the most part.
Awesome. Yeah, that's great. Yeah, let's see. We have John Burley asked, if the roots are partially damaged, what are the impacts to survival? Is it best practice to translocate when soil moisture is higher because there's potentially less damage to hair roots?
We try to transplant when they're dormant, actually, but sometimes that doesn't work with snow. So we get there as late in the fall or early in the spring as we can. We've done both. And when we do damage a root, like if we strip the root, we'll just snip it off so that the wound is just a cross section as opposed to a long damaged root. But we The root hairs is definitely something we try not to damage whatsoever. So we try not to excavate and have like a bare root situation. We try to excavate the whole root mass with soil intact. If you think about a burlap wrap tree, almost like that, with a ton of soil in there with it. So those photos did show roots for sure, but we try not to have exposed roots at all.
Wow, sounds hard.
Yeah, and industrial players have the advantage of machinery, etc. But a few ski hills have asked about doing it in the national parks where their groomers are going to start trimming trees off as they grow up through the snow. And in the national parks, that's a problem because the SARA Act is, they can't damage whitebark. So they're looking for alternatives. And, if they can move them little when they're super tiny on the ski runs, they could probably just do it by hand and not need machines. But yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, that's a really good point. All right. Jen Atkins asked, were there many differences in survival on these hot versus cool sites based on planting times, such as summer versus fall plantings?
No, they were planted the same day, both all these sites. Like obviously they weren't, but the hot, cool Skyline site was planted the same day, and the Bill Nye site, hot, cool, was planted on the same day, and they were all fall planted. Um, and truthfully, when we looked at the hot sites on both of these, we were a little nervous for sure. But we thought, if we get good fall rains, etc., it should be fine, which we did get at Bill Nye. We did not get at Skyline. And there were a lot of dead whitebark skeletons on those slopes that, kind of think, whitebark can live there, but maybe don't plant it there.
All right. John Van Gundy asked, what are the lengths of your planting spreads?
Lengths of the planting spreads. Not entirely sure like how big are they? Or?
That's all I wrote. I don't
Okay.
know, John, maybe you can chime in the chat if you have something you want to add. I was hoping maybe you knew what that meant.
Yeah, area wise, they're typically about 8 hectares or so. We plant 5,000. We try to hit about 5,000. We do it in a single day usually.
Yeah, I think that's what he's meaning is like how much time of the spread are we talking here? And you kind of answered that.
Oh,
So
distance. Distance
okay.
is roughly 4 meters. We try to hit about 620 per hectare. 620 whitebark per hectare if possible. But on those hot, dry sites, quite often you're limited by rock, etc. And then on the cool sites, you're limited by things like competition, etc. So, we plan 620 a hectare, but we're often a little lower than that in certain areas because you're spacing off totally different things, rock and poor soil and competition centers.
Cool. Elizabeth Barnes asked, have you ever seen any research on the fabric cone collection cages?
Fabric. We did use a plastic fabric before. It was like a plastic mesh that was really tight. I guess they use it like in clam product. They grow clams inside of it or something on the coast. They worked for year one, and then once the plastic deteriorated a little bit, they totally deteriorated. We're back to wire mesh. So they worked wonders in the first year. In the second year, as the plastic degraded, both rodents chewed through it and they actually melted in the hot sun. So wire mesh, we still use wire mesh.
Yeah, those are tough conditions out there. Charlie Crockett asked, are you aware of any First Nations collecting, eating seeds? And if so, can we get some recipes? Is it legal? I guess is one question.
Is it legal? If you're out of the national parks, it's legal. And pretty much every First Nation I work with, an elder will talk about eating the seeds. 100%. And they often roasted them. They'd often throw the whole cone in the fire and roast them that
Oh,
way instead of picking them up by hand. And then once the pitch was all burned off, then they'd dig it out and eat it that way.
oh, that's cool. Thanks for sharing that. All right. Amanda Horning asked, including the soil of the root ball also includes the fungi in the soil. Does this have any effects if the mycorrhizae are present or not?
Probably, but we don't know. The donor or the recipient sites where these have all been moved to are also white bark pine areas where there's natural white bark pine, say 5 meters away. So I don't think there's any fungal deficiencies either way. It's possible some of that gets broken off when you're excavating and moving it, but like I said, we try to keep the whole root mass together, and that's why we start so wide and dig and slowly work our way in. And once you're in, you kind of just go down and try to get under and pull the whole thing out. That's where machines are handy, but yeah.
Okay, awesome. All right, I think we have time for a couple more that snuck in here at the end. So John Burley asked, is there a specific mechanical or excavator mound treatment prescription that was used on the disturbed sites?
They just ripped apart the soil, kind of just loosened it. The backhoe operators went in there and just dug it up. And I should add, some people ask if they grew so well because maybe the topsoil that was there before got mixed within, but it didn't. There's a big berm around these areas, and it's just mineral soil. The B and C horizons getting churned up. All the organics are stripped away and gone.
Okay, awesome. I'm not sure what PA stands for. That might be my own
That's
ignorance.
that's white bark
Okay.
in
I'm not
Canada, or at least in
sure.
BC it is. And yeah.
Okay,
Uh,
makes sense. Yeah, I'll go ahead and repeat the question just for everybody. So the question from Mason McDonald is potential planting or existing white bark on north-facing aspects or slopes? Question mark.
yeah. 100% there is. But what we find is if you have a ridge, let's say, and down the south aspect, white bark will stretch, say, 100 meters down the slope, and then the north aspect, it only stretch 20 meters down the slope because competition picks up so much. So those steep north aspects, you're kind of running that north ridge part a little bit onto the slope. But if you go too far down, quite often you'll get it. But if you have rocky soil on the north slope, you definitely get white bark pine on the north aspects. And often we're looking just for like a gentle sort of rolling terrain where, it's suitable for anybody. It's not too extreme, but yeah, totally. We planted on steep north slopes, but it's a bit of an it depends.
Awesome. Wow, I think we got through all of them, I'm pretty sure. A lot of good positive feedback in the chat. So I'm going to go ahead and wrap up here. On behalf of the Whitebark Pine Ecosystem Foundation and the webinar organization team, I just want to thank Randy again for coming out today. This was, like I said, awesome presentation. I think it was a nice contrast to some of the more research-heavy talks that we've had previously. So it's really great to have a good mix. Our next webinar will be on March 18th with Kira Hefty presenting her work, Rad Decisions in Rad Landscapes, Adaptations for Whitebark Pine and Wilderness. So I hope you can all attend to that. Thanks again, everyone, for attending, and stay tuned for our upcoming installments. See you next month.
Excellent. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Randy.